Our culture, especially as it is reflected through television, is obsessed with things sexual. I know it's what sells, and it's what titillates. But what we see on TV frequently distorts both the meaning of love and the meaning of sexuality. As one mother of 11 children said, "We are being manipulated by the media into thinking that sex is the big deal in life, when actually love is the big deal in life." In our culture and on television, the tail tends to wag the dog when love and sexuality are presented. Sexual attraction and actions are often equated with love in many of the movies and advertisements, in the soaps and music videos. Sex, there, seems to be the primary meaning of love. But you know, our religious institutions present a quite different version. Human sexuality is human when it is loving. And love involves a choice of the will, not just an attraction. It's a choice to care for another. It channels sexuality into expressions that foster mutual growth. I want to share something with you from a book by Evelyn Duell. It's called Love and the Facts of Life. She says there, "Sex can be fine and full. It can also be painful, restricting, and shameful. Like every other source of power, it must be harnessed, or it runs wild and becomes destructive. Electricity, wired into your home, will perform all sorts of miracles. But left unleashed as lightning, electricity can destroy everything that you care about in one burning holocaust." One of the first things that must be done to manage either electricity or sexuality is to understand it as completely as possible. And that's only possible when the subject is discussed openly and thoroughly. That's why this series is exploring the relationship between love and sexuality from as many dimensions as possible. To begin today's discussion, let's listen to a song by Gene Berger entitled "Heart." It's about a man named Pierrot. Pierrot decided to open himself to others. But when he did hang his heart upon the wall, no one cared, no one listened. So Pierrot despaired and retreated, taking with him his neglected heart. Joanne LeKay Sims is the soloist. What a touching and sad song. So Pierrot took his heart and hid it far away. Now people wonder where his heart is today. Hiding our inner life and its longings is a tragic way to live. Matters of the heart need expression. Fortunately, people are a good deal more open to discuss such matters now than when I was young. One of my boyhood friends reminded me recently of the way things were when we were growing up. His parents had avoided all mention of sexuality to the boy. He found himself confused by new feelings in his own body, so he tried to talk to his father. But my friend recalled that his father made him feel embarrassed, ashamed, and turned the whole matter over to his mother. She shared her husband's reluctance to talk, and so instead she bought him a book on sexuality. Well, it turned out to be merely a book on human anatomy, without any discussion of love or relationship or the meaning of sexuality. Unfortunately, nothing further was ever discussed between the boy and his parents. They did say to him at one point, "If you have any questions, just ask us," but, well, you can imagine he was never really comfortable asking. Little by little, the influence of his friends and the culture began to form his attitudes about sexuality. He told me that he spent several years confused and unnecessarily guilty as a result. Well, let's hope that things are a bit different in many homes today, and if they're not, perhaps they could be. 3 people who stress the importance of such open communication about love and sexuality are Richard Bales, a sociologist, Barbara Hartnett, a psychologist, and Gary Link, a psychotherapist. Let's learn from their insights. One of the great problems in people's sexual development and sexual growth, I understand, is that of communicating about the topic. What keeps people from talking about their own sexual needs and desires and development?
I think a problem that the vast majority of people have is when we're first growing up learning words, we really don't learn the sexual words. Or first we learn baby talk. Then when we start talking about sex, we're really not sure what words we can use, or what we should use, or what we even feel comfortable using. You know, by the time you hit high school, you may have had maybe a little bit of sex education, so you may know some of the scientific medical terms, the more official terms that we're supposed to use. A lot of times we're not really sure what the meanings of those are. We still have the baby talk that mom and dad taught us. You know, those terms that are okay to say in front of aunts and uncles, things like that. Then there's also all the slang that we hear while growing up. I find in doing therapy with individuals and with couples, before I can really start talking about what is the problem or what brought them into counseling is what words are we going to use. I feel that in my training I'm basically comfortable to use any of those types of terminology.
Do you have to bring them to a certain level of language before you can move them ahead?
Well, I think instead of kind of bringing them up to like maybe where I'm at, it's more appropriate for me to go to the level that they're at as far as what language they feel comfortable. I was working with a 20-year-old the other day, a college student, who really did not know the scientific technical terms, but was very familiar with the slang. So I said, I kind of assumed that that's what he would feel comfortable using. And I let him know that I feel comfortable using those terms also.
Did that remove some of the block?
Right. I think you could almost see just in the body language of that person, oh, okay, I can use the words that I know now. And I think that before that, he was putting me on this pedestal that, well, a therapist is only going to use the scientific, technical terms.
What about the problem of communicating between a husband and a wife, or between friends? How do you remove those blocks? You were talking about a psychotherapist helping to remove the block, but suppose it's just 2 ordinary folks who want to talk more freely. Is that much of a problem today?
Yes, I think it's a very large problem. I think it's really the heart of the matter in regard to any kind of dyadic difficulties, any kind of relationship. Language, communication is important. I think really it's very painful. The only way people can overcome their fear of communicating is to start doing it, is to practice. It's like anything else. It may be very difficult. One may feel very inhibited. One may be embarrassed initially. But I think any effort made in that direction is worth pursuing, even if you don't have to be 100% in it.
I would suggest that this is going to be less of a problem in the future as we go down the road. My generation, for example, there were a few places where one could comfortably talk about sex. We weren't allowed to talk about sex in the schools. In some cases, we weren't allowed to talk about sex in the church. We couldn't talk about sex in the home. So there were very few places that we could talk about sex. And as you indicated, we grow more comfortable talking about those topics the more that we do it. And I'm suggesting that this generation progressively will be more comfortable talking about that.
As we become more comfortable with that, we obviously become more comfortable with ourselves, because we are sexual beings in all that we are and do. I know we talked recently, the four of us, about the importance of self-esteem in psychosexual growth. Does someone want to comment on that?
I think it's a factor that's very much related to inability to communicate. I think that females, for example, in our society have often been raised, again, particularly women who are my age by now, have been raised to believe that it is somehow pushy, it is somehow unfeminine to communicate to a partner, this is what I want, this is what I like, this is what would make me happy or fulfilled. And I think if a woman has a negative self-image, if she fears, oh, if I tell him this, he won't love me anymore, he'll leave me, I think that is a very good example of that tie-in between self-image and the ability to communicate. For men, it's a little different. In our society, men are supposed to know it all. So a man may feel uncomfortable talking about his feelings. He may have no experience expressing himself. He may think he's not macho if he does that. That's very inhibitory.
Macho would be one of the models, I suppose, we have for sexual acting out and sexual communication. Part of the problem, I suppose, is that we don't have adequate models for communicating and behaving in this way.
In psychology, there are two fundamental requisites for successful learning. One is low anxiety, and the second is effective models. When it comes to our sexuality, those two things, it's astounding we function as well as we do, because there are few behaviors that are wrought with more anxiety for most people, and we have no models, really, that are helpful, useful, effective, realistic, etc.
Well, when I was growing up, I think our parents were supposed to be the models, but I know among young people today, it's peers that they look to, or television stars, rock stars, MTV stars, to get their models for behavior. Isn't that a drastic shift from parent to peers? And what's the effect of that? Makes it more shaky, it seems to me.
It makes it more fragile, more susceptible to change, I think. The peer group, you're correct. The peer group is an extremely important agency in terms of socialization at this point in time, much more than ever before in our history. And I think what we've seen with the lessening of the influence of the family in terms of socialization and increase in terms of the importance of the peer group.
Would you and Gary in your counseling work have any particular examples of that, of how the peers become the models, sexual role models?
Well, I think while in those formative years, 13, 14, 15, when you're developing sexually, you're not really sure what you should be doing, you know, what is okay. There's a lot of pressure from your peers. A lot of the teenage movies that show that, you know, it's okay to be sexual, and it's and generally in those films, you don't see the use of contraception. You know, the only value is, you know, to have fun. Then for the kids that really do not feel like they're ready to be sexually active, then is it okay for them not to? There's all that pressure, and there certainly isn't a role model out there that says, you know, I'm 15 and I don't want to have sex and I'm not ready to, and that's okay.
So our culture really needs to provide healthy, integrated, adequate role models for good psychosexual development.
One of the great problems in discussing love and sexuality is the large amount of misinformation that's floating around in our sexually saturated culture. The wonderful mystery of human sexuality can be distorted by unfounded but quite common myths. I asked our three guests to discuss some of the more prevalent of these false impressions. We tend to think of sex education as being something for young people who are inexperienced and unknowing, but I know that adults need as much education about sexuality as the children in a way, because so often adults operate out of myths. Let's look at some of those myths now. First, the myth that there is a sexual revolution, that there has been one. Is that a myth, or is it a fact? What do the statistics show? What do you all think?
That's a good question. It's difficult to prove that indeed a sexual revolution has occurred. And it's difficult to prove because primarily all of our statistics are flawed. For one reason or another, virtually all of the sexual surveys that have been done have not been done in the correct way, have not followed correct procedures. For example, one of the more prominent techniques that's been employed is what's called a self-selection. The individuals involved in the sample are self-selected. Let me give an example. A few years back, a very prominent polling firm on the West Coast was commissioned to do a study, a survey of the American public, more specifically American parents. And they posed the question then to parents, if you had the choice to make all over again, would you have children? And again, this was a well-respected firm that followed all the correct techniques in terms of sampling. And they found that roughly 90% of the American parents indicated that if they had it to do over again, they would indeed have children. About that same time, Ann Landers posed that same question to her readers and asked her readers to respond. She found, based on what she got in terms of response, again a self-selected sample, 70% of her respondents indicated that they would not. Now that's a tremendous margin of error, and I would suggest that's the sort of thing that has characterized most of the studies that have taken place. So what I'm suggesting is that we don't really know that a sexual revolution has occurred. I think perhaps a more appropriate term might be sexual evolution, a gradual change over time.
Well, we do know that people are talking more openly and communicating more about it.
Yeah, we can clearly demonstrate, based on sound data, that their attitudes have changed. Whether or not their behavior has changed is a difficult question to answer.
I see. Another one of the myths about sexuality that tends to plague adults is that men are the initiators. Men are the ones who are interested in sex. They're the experts.
People that do sex therapy, I think, will often mention this, that that's often a cause of people's difficulties in a relationship because of the stereotyped images that we're raised to believe. Men are supposed to be the experts. They're supposed to know everything there is to know about sexuality. That's a very large pressure to put on half of our population to be the expert in a particular area. Women, on the other hand, have labored from the opposite extreme, and we have been led to believe that we should not be interested in sex. It's somehow unladylike, we should be passive, and that's men's work, etc. I see that in my own sexuality education classes, where a large proportion of my students are women. Because to be 18 years old and admit you need to take a sex class is certainly difficult to do.
That's even reflected in an old scientific understanding of the relationship between the sperm and the egg. I think it was about 100 years ago that we discovered that the egg has an active role to play in creating a baby. Before, the sperm was the active, and the egg was seen as just the passive recipient.
The soil in which it was planted.
The soil, and that would be reflected in the way women perceive themselves in the whole thing. Another myth is that sex is genitality, that sex is the act rather than the whole relationship. I think that the movies and songs and those expressions in our culture tend to enhance that limited understanding, that myth.
Yes, I always, again, I try to tell my students, sex is something you are. It's not something you do. It's one of the most fundamental organizing principles of the human personality. Before we learn we are anything else, we learn that we are male people or female people, and from birth to death, we are sexual. It is not just, you can be sexual and never engage in any specific genital activity with another person. That doesn't negate your sexuality.
How does that relate, Barbara, to the sense of masculinity and femininity that could be blended in one person?
I am male, you are female, but in us are masculine traits and feminine traits.
Again, that's part of that stereotype, that because of those stereotypes, men have been forced to submerge really very important elements in their person, expressing themselves, their emotionality, their vulnerability. Those have been unacceptable to show in public. Women, on the other hand, for many reasons, have been forced to subjugate perhaps their creativity, their assertiveness, their competence in many areas. So it's really, we've wasted much human potential because of those stereotypes, and I hope that's changing.
A couple of another one relates to sexuality and older people. There's this myth that sexuality has to do with the young and the beautiful, the young and the restless. But apparently that's not true. Older people also need tactility, genitality, they need involvement and tenderness.
Yeah, I've seen that in clients with working with couples that will come in and feel that once they reach a certain age, then their sexual activity will just disappear. They will no longer be interested, or also that they won't be able to do it, get involved, and the male may not, may have problems. So there's that feeling of, well, we better enjoy it now because it's going to stop soon. I think something that's really sad, a couple that I knew that were placed in a retirement home, and this was the type of home that had a male wing and a female wing. Well, they were married. They were just coming from a small home that they could no longer take care of. For financial reasons, they had to go into this home. Well, the husband went to the male wing, the wife went to the female wing, with the idea that, well, there would be no reason to sleep together. They were in their 70s. Why would they want to sleep together? So they're certainly not having sex. I think that's sad for the people running that type of a facility to have those feelings.
I think our culture has so sold sex as a physical thing for youth that, as we were talking earlier before the interview, when you get to be 30, you begin to realize it's beginning to be all over, and you get to be 40 and you know it is, and you get to be 50 and you kind of don't care. But that's not really true, unless you buy the myth that what it's about to be alive is to be young and beautiful. Sexuality and relationality goes on till you die.
A devastating myth, for example, to people that are physically handicapped. Has been extremely serious on an individual level. We have totally somehow led people to believe that if they were in a wheelchair, for example, they should no longer be interested in things sexual. Young 19-year-old men who had been injured in a motorcycle accident had been led to believe, well, this is it. It's all over for you. You don't fit our model any longer. You don't want it. So much cruelty, really, much hardship to people.
One last myth relates to gay and lesbian people. The stereotype is the limp-wristed, effeminate gay and the butch and dyke and very strong lesbian, all of whom are limited in their occupation, their dress, their lifestyle. They're alone, they're lonely, they're without hope. That's the stereotype. That's the myth. To what extent is that wrong, and to what extent is it an accurate portrayal of people who are marginalized in our society, marginalized sexually?
I think that's a very good example of what Rich mentioned earlier, the poor data we have. Virtually all of the data we have regarding gay, lesbian people up until very recently has been derived from gay, lesbian people who have been unhappy enough, miserable enough, anxious enough, pressured enough to seek help and therapy. And from that limit, it's like assuming, it's like generalizing from a group of psychiatric patients to all the rest of human beings. And it's been, again, we really don't know how accurate that is, but we know that the data is obviously biased that we're getting. But ordinary, well-adjusted, happy gay, lesbian people don't wend themselves into the research. They attract no attention.
How will the myth be dispelled, if that is indeed a myth?
One-on-one is usually the best way.
Talking about sexuality and dispelling some of the myths about sexuality has been our subject today. I hope you're finding this part of More Than Meets the Eye a useful exploration for you and your families. I want to close today by singing of a love and a union that begins in the human and moves toward the divine. For a believing person, for one who looks for greater meaning in life, the wonder and mystery of human sexuality are a foreshadowing of the loving union into which our God calls us. And it is of that love that I sing in this work by Rafe Vaughan Williams. It's entitled, The Call.
Come my way, my truth, my life, such a way as gives us breath, such a truth as ends all strife, such a life as killeth death. Come, my light, my feast, my strength, such a light as shows a feast, such a feast as mends in length, such a strength as makes his guest. Come, my joy, my love, my heart, such a joy as none can move, such a love as none can part, such a love as joys in love.
This program is made possible by a donation from Security Savings and Loan Association of Peoria, Illinois.
Hello and welcome to More Than Meets the Eye. On this series of programs, you're invited to join on a journey inside your own lives. It's a bargain trip because it won't cost you anything, at least not financially. It's a tour that won't even take you far from where you are right now, at least not geographically. But the cost and the distance to be traveled on More Than Meets the Eye could be great, because it is to be a transforming trip, one that may just change us. Hello, I'm Father Patrick Collins, welcoming you to More Than Meets the Eye. In this series, we've been looking into the meaning of human love and sexuality. As we've studied the Judeo-Christian tradition and some of the human sciences, we've learned that our sexuality is an important way that we relate to others, to ourselves, to God. It's much more than a function of our bodies. It's bound more significantly with who we are as persons. Unfortunately, our culture tends to blur the distinction between genital sex and being sexual persons. As we've mentioned before, sexuality is about relationship, and relating happens in many more ways than simply genital. We do, of course, express love with our bodies, but there are many levels of relatedness. First, there's the feeling of love for another. We call this affectivity. Affection is the vital part of our sexuality. It allows us to express to others what we long for ourselves. Human touch is also a way of being sexual with others. As one grows in intimacy with another, the tenderness of a caress transforms touch into an expression of love. In this way, it can become